Welcome to the deep dive.
Hello.
Today, we're going to really dig into some recent news sources. We're focusing specifically on excerpts from May 23rd, 2025, pulling out the key developments.
Yeah, we've sifted through quite a bit. Reports covering, the U.S. economy, trade relations, some domestic unrest, immigration policy. It's a real mix.
Right, the idea is to give you a quick, clear handle on what's happening across these areas based on this material.
Think of it like the essential briefing, just the core insights.
Okay, let's jump right in. What do we see first in the sources?
Well, starting with the economy, there's a pretty stark number that grabs your attention straight away. A projected loss of over $10 billion in international tourism revenue for the U.S. in 2025.
Wow, okay. 10 billion. That's
Yeah.
significant. Do the sources say why?
They do. They point to a steep decline in global traveler confidence.
Okay, confidence. And what's driving that decline, according to these reports?
They connected to a few things: tightened U.S. visa rules,
Right.
stricter immigration enforcement actions.
And also the rising strength of the U.S. dollar. Makes it more expensive to visit.
Yeah, that makes sense. All those factors combined. The sources flagged this as a troubling trend for tourism here.
Exactly. A troubling trend. And you think about, hotels, restaurants, local businesses, that $10 billion hit has real consequences.
Definitely impacts jobs and communities.
But interestingly, the economic picture isn't all negative in these reports. They also mention a pickup in overall U.S. business activity in May.
Ah, so there are those mixed signals again. Activity's up.
Yeah, but then the same sources warn that President Trump's tax cuts and tariffs, they're poised to accelerate inflation pretty sharply.
Right, so potential growth, but also rising prices. You can sort of feel that tension.
You really can. And the sources say it's reflected in the stock market, too. Lots of volatility mentioned.
Investors reacting to uncertainty, I guess, around trade policies, global supply chains, that kind of thing.
That's exactly how the reports frame it.
Okay, so shifting from the domestic economy more towards international relations. A big development highlighted is the U.S. picking a design for that huge missile defense shield project.
The Golden Dome project, yeah.
Oh,
$175 billion.
Yeah.
That's massive.
it really is. A system designed to intercept missiles. And when you announce something like that,
You expect reaction.
exactly, and the sources point immediately to China expressing serious concerns.
Okay, so that adds another layer of complexity to the U.S.-China relationship, which we know is already tricky with trade and tariffs.
Definitely. And it's not just China reacting. The reports also mention South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan.
G-Tech partners, right? What do they say?
Well, they're raising concerns about the potential downsides of U.S. chip tariffs, those taxes on imported computer chips.
Yeah.
They're apparently calling for a sort of rethinking of these new levies.
So you've got defense projects causing ripples and trade tariffs causing friction with allies.
Yeah, and the sources really emphasize how these things are linked, how these tensions can affect global supply chains, economic stability. It all feeds back.
It's a very interconnected picture they're painting.
Yep.
Let's bring it back home then to the domestic front. The sources talk about civil unrest, specifically protests at Columbia University's graduation.
Yeah, that's mentioned. And the reports detail the reasons behind those protests,
Sure.
ongoing anger over the Gaza war, primarily, and also related to the arrest of a student protester, Mahmoud Khalil.
Right, I remember seeing his name. So the sources see this as more than just a campus issue.
Very much so. They frame it as reflecting these bigger national debates we're having about foreign policy, about civil liberties.
Playing out visibly on campus.
Exactly. And it's not just campus protests mentioned either. There's also note of a nationwide boycott targeting Walmart.
A Walmart boycott.
Yeah.
Okay, who's behind that, according to the sources?
An organization called the People's Union USA.
And the reasons?
The reports cite protests against the company's labor practices and its overall impact on local communities.
So quite different focuses there. Foreign policy and civil rights on campus, economic and labor issues with the boycott.
Right. But the sources kind of connect them by suggesting they both show this growing public engagement, people getting involved in social and economic issues across the board.
Okay, let's move to immigration. What did the sources highlight there?
Well, one specific action detailed is the U.S. starting deportations of about 12 South Asian migrants back to South Sudan.
To South Sudan.
Yep.
How is that being framed in the reports?
It's immediately raising questions, they say,
Yep.
about current immigration policies, human rights concerns.
Understandable.
Yeah, sparking discussion about, how migrants are treated and the wider implications for U.S. policy.
And speaking of complex legal and rights issues, there was also a legal development mentioned involving that Columbia student protester.
Oh, Oh, Mahmoud Khalil again.
Yeah. A federal judge ruled that he must be allowed to meet with his wife while detained.
Ah, okay. So that ties back into the protest context. But it's also presented as another example, right, of these ongoing legal battles around immigration and civil rights that the sources are tracking.
Exactly. It shows these issues are being fought out in the courts, too.
Now, there were a couple of other interesting trends in the sources that didn't quite fit those main boxes.
Like what?
Well, first, this report about record-breaking travel over Memorial Day weekend.
Record-breaking, even with all the economic worries we just talked about, and airline issues?
Apparently so, which is,
Yeah.
yeah, it seems a bit contradictory, doesn't it?
It really does. How do the sources explain that?
They interpret it as signaling maybe a significant revival in U.S. tourism, or at least a very strong desire people have to travel, despite anxieties.
Huh. Quite the juxtaposition.
It is. And then contrasting that, the sources also raise an alarm about a potential new wave of price hikes coming.
Oh, great. Why now?
The reasoning given is that businesses might be sort of running out of ways to absorb their own rising costs.
So they have to pass them on to consumers.
That seems to be the concern highlighted. Which, of course, feeds back into worries about inflation and hitting people's wallets.
Right. When they might be feeling confident enough to travel,
Yeah.
potentially facing higher prices across the board. So if you step back and look at everything these sources are reporting, you've got the projected tourism dip linked to policy and the dollar. You've got business activity picking up, but warnings about inflation from taxes and tariffs.
Right, those global trade tensions reacting to big defense spending and the chip tariffs.
Then the domestic scene with protests about foreign policy and boycotts about labor.
Immigration actions sparking debate, legal challenges on rights.
And all this happening while people are apparently traveling in record numbers, yet there's this fear of new price hikes. Well, it's a lot of different forces pulling at once.
It really paints a picture of interconnectedness, doesn't it? You see how a defense decision impacts trade, which impacts the economy, how global events trigger local protests, how policy on immigration touches on really fundamental rights questions.
Absolutely. Every piece seems to influence the others in some way based on these reports.
Which leaves you with some thinking to do.
Definitely. Like, here's a final thought just based purely on this source material we've discussed.
Yeah.
You have these reported economic fears, warnings about price hikes.
Yeah.
But at the same time, record-breaking holiday travel.
Yeah.
What does that combination, that apparent contradiction between caution and spending, actually suggest about the mood or maybe the priorities across the U.S. right now?
That's a fascinating question to chew on. Is it pent-up demand? Are people prioritizing experiences over saving right now despite the risks? Or is it something else entirely?
Yeah, the sources lay out the data points, the trends, but understanding the why behind that specific combination.
That requires a bit more mulling.
Exactly. And that's sort of the point of this deep dive, isn't it? We've unpacked what we saw as the key takeaways from the material today.
And hopefully given you plenty to think about.
We definitely encourage you to keep exploring these topics yourself, see what other connections or conclusions you draw.